The beginning of change. Angela adjusted her simple yet elegant black dress as she stepped out of the car, the crisp evening air brushing against her skin. Michael, her husband, buttoned his suit jacket and gave her a reassuring smile as they approached the grand entrance of the Marlowe, one of the city's most prestigious hotels. It wasn't their first time visiting such an establishment, but tonight felt different. The towering glass facade shimmered with gold reflections from the ornate chandeliers inside, a stark contrast to the nervous energy Angela felt bubbling beneath her composed exterior. "Ready?" Michael asked, his deep voice steady and calm. Angela nodded, her grip tightening on the small clutch in her hands. "As ready as I'll ever be." The revolving doors ushered them into a world of opulence. High ceilings adorned with intricate frescoes stretched above their heads, and the scent of fresh-cut roses mingled with the faint aroma of gourmet dishes wafting from the hotel restaurant. Around them, impeccably dressed guests moved with an air of entitlement, their conversations punctuated by bursts of polite laughter. The host station stood at the entrance of the restaurant, manned by a sharply dressed maitre d', whose practiced smile faltered the moment he saw them. Angela and Michael approached, their confident strides betraying none of the unease they felt under the weight of the stairs around them. Whispers began to ripple through the room like a low tide. "Are they lost?" a woman murmured behind a gilded menu, her tone dripping with disdain. Angela caught the comment but ignored it, her posture straightening as Michael spoke to the maitre d'. "Good evening. Reservation for Carter. Table for two." The maitre d' blinked, his polished demeanor flickering for a moment before he glanced down at his ledger. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice clipped. "If you'll follow me, please." Angela exchanged a glance with Michael. The maitre d's hesitance was subtle but unmistakable. As they were led through the grand dining hall, eyes followed them, some curious, others openly judgmental. The whispers grew louder, and Angela felt her chest tighten. She placed a hand lightly on Michael's arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. The restaurant was a masterpiece of design. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over velvet-lined chairs, marble floors reflecting the golden glow, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Yet amidst all this beauty, Angela couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. The maitre d' came to an abrupt stop at a small, dimly lit table near the kitchen doors. He gestured toward it with a tight-lipped smile. "Your table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter." Michael raised an eyebrow, his imposing frame towering over the maitre d'. "We'd prefer a table by the windows," he said, his tone calm but firm. The maitre d' hesitated, his gaze darting toward the tables in question, each unoccupied but pristinely set. "I'm afraid those are reserved for VIP guests, sir. Your reservation specifies this section." Angela took a deep breath, her patience waning. "There's no one sitting there now," she said, her voice measured. "Surely one table can be made available." The maitre d's smile tightened further. "I assure you, this table is more suitable." "Suitable for whom?" Michael asked, his tone dropping an octave. His gaze locked on the maitre d', whose polished exterior began to crumble under the scrutiny. The tension was palpable. A man seated nearby chuckled loudly, murmuring something to his companion that drew laughter. Angela clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around her clutch. Michael stepped forward, his voice now low and deliberate. "We'll sit where we're comfortable, or perhaps we'll leave. Which would you prefer?" The maitre d' swallowed hard, his discomfort evident. After a moment of hesitation, he relented, gesturing toward a table near the windows, but slightly off-center. "Of course, sir. Right this way." As they settled into their seats, Angela couldn't help but notice the deliberate glance a woman at the next table gave her before whispering to her dining partner. "Standards here are slipping." The woman's words weren't subtle, and Angela felt her cheeks flush with anger. Michael, ever the steady presence, opened the menu as if nothing had happened. "Red wine?" he asked casually, his tone light. Angela forced a smile, her voice strained. "Perfect." The waiter arrived moments later, a young man whose nervous energy was hard to miss. "Good evening," he began, his eyes flicking between them. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Michael didn't look up from the menu. "Your best red wine." The waiter hesitated, doubt flickering across his face. Perhaps the sommelier could recommend something more approachable. Angela set her menu down sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Do we look like we need recommendations for a cheaper option?" The waiter's cheeks flushed. "No, ma'am. Of course not. I'll bring the wine right away." As he hurried off, Angela leaned forward, her voice low. "Do you ever get tired of this?" Michael met her gaze, his expression calm. "No, because I refuse to let them have that power over me." Their moment of quiet was interrupted by the arrival of the sommelier, who poured their wine with practiced precision, avoiding eye contact entirely. Angela sipped her glass, the rich flavors doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. Minutes later, the maitre d' returned, this time accompanied by the restaurant manager. A tall man with a practiced smile approached their table, his tone dripping with insincere charm. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. I understand there was a concern about your seating arrangements. I do hope everything is satisfactory now." Michael's expression didn't waver. "Not particularly, but we'll manage." The manager's smile faltered. "If there's anything we can do to enhance your experience, please don't hesitate to let us know." Angela tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "How about ensuring your staff doesn't make assumptions about who deserves to sit where?" The manager stammered, his confidence wavering. "I assure you, ma'am, there was no such intention." "Of course not," Angela replied coolly, taking another sip of wine. As the manager retreated, Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze scanning the room. "Think they'll take us seriously?" Angela's lips curled into a faint smile. "They will. Sooner than they think." The dining room hummed with tension, the murmurs growing louder as patrons speculated about the couple's presence. Unbeknownst to the onlookers, Michael and Angela weren't there for a simple dinner. They were here for something much more profound, something that would shake the very foundation of the establishment. As the waiter returned to take their order, Michael glanced at his watch and then at the young man. "We'd like to speak to the hotel director." The waiter blinked, visibly thrown. "The director, sir?" "Yes," Michael said, his voice firm. "Now." The young man nodded quickly, retreating toward the kitchen. As he disappeared, Angela leaned toward Michael, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think they're ready for what's coming?" Michael chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with quiet determination. "Not even close." The revelation. The dining room's hum of conversation dropped noticeably, replaced by the subtle tension of curious glances and speculative whispers. Angela and Michael remained seated near the grand windows, their presence commanding yet understated. The staff moved with nervous energy, whispering in corners and casting furtive glances toward the couple. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression calm and composed, while Angela toyed with the stem of her wine glass, her eyes scanning the opulent room. The young waiter reappeared, his posture rigid as he approached their table. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "The director will see you shortly. He's been notified of your request." Angela offered him a tight-lipped smile. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone neutral but firm. The waiter hesitated, as if expecting further instructions, but Michael dismissed him with a nod. As the waiter retreated, Michael glanced at Angela, his lips twitching into a faint smirk. "They're scrambling," he remarked, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard. "They should be," Angela replied, her tone cool. "This is a reckoning, Michael, and they know it." Michael's gaze drifted across the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The whispered conversations at nearby tables, the way certain guests turned their noses up as if offended by their presence, and the subdued urgency in the staff's movements. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "This isn't just about us, Angela. It's about everyone who's ever walked into a place like this and felt invisible." Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. And everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. The sound of hurried footsteps drew their attention. Gregory Wallace, the hotel director, strode into the dining room, his tailored navy suit immaculate and his expression carefully neutral. He was flanked by the restaurant manager, who looked significantly less composed. The whispers among the patrons intensified as all eyes followed Wallace's approach. The director stopped a few feet from their table, his practiced smile firmly in place. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I understand you requested to speak with me. How can I assist you this evening?" Michael stood, his imposing frame making Wallace instinctively take a half-step back. "Good evening, Mr. Wallace," Michael said, extending a hand. "We appreciate you coming to meet us on such short notice." Wallace hesitated, clearly thrown off by the formality, but he recovered quickly and shook Michael's hand. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "At the Marlowe, guest satisfaction is our top priority. Please, tell me how we can make your evening more enjoyable." Angela rose gracefully from her chair, her emerald green dress catching the light. "It's not about tonight, Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice measured. "It's about the culture of this hotel." Wallace's confident facade faltered slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter, I'm not sure I understand." Michael stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "We've encountered attitudes here tonight that are, frankly, unacceptable. And based on the reactions of both your staff and patrons, I'd wager this isn't an isolated incident." Wallace's smile tightened, and he glanced around the room as if searching for an escape route. "I deeply regret if any member of our staff has made you feel unwelcome," he said carefully. "I assure you, this is not indicative of the Marlowe's values." Angela tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Are you certain about that, Mr. Wallace? Because from where we're standing, it seems your staff has been trained to make assumptions, and those assumptions are rooted in prejudice." The whispers around them grew louder, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Wallace shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their stares, but he maintained his composure. "If you'd like to discuss this further," he said, his tone conciliatory, "perhaps we could move to my office. I'd be happy to address your concerns in private." Michael shook his head. "No, here is fine." Wallace blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Here," he echoed. "Yes," Angela said firmly. "Here, where your staff and guests can witness this conversation. Transparency, Mr. Wallace, is key to accountability." The director hesitated, his polished exterior cracking as he realized there was no easy way out of this confrontation. Finally, he nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice strained. "What would you like to discuss?" Michael crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Let's start with the seating arrangements. Why were we escorted to the least desirable table in the restaurant when there were clearly better options available?" Wallace opened his mouth to respond, but Angela cut him off. "And don't tell us it was a mistake," she said sharply. "We both know it wasn't." The director's face reddened, and he glanced at the restaurant manager, who looked like he wished he could disappear. "Our seating policies are designed to ensure a pleasant experience for all our guests," Wallace said weakly. "There may have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Michael interrupted, his voice cold. "Your maitre d' looked us up and down and decided we didn't belong near the windows. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Wallace. That's discrimination." Wallace's composure crumbled further under Michael's unwavering gaze. I'm deeply sorry if that's how it came across," he stammered. "I assure you, it was not intentional." Angela let out a humorless laugh. "Not intentional. Mr. Wallace, prejudice doesn't have to be intentional to be harmful, and the harm it causes is real." Wallace's face was now ashen, and he seemed at a loss for words. Around them, the dining room had gone eerily quiet, the patrons hanging on every word of the conversation. Angela took a step closer, her tone softening slightly but losing none of its edge. The problem, Mr. Wallace, isn't just your staff. It's the culture you've allowed to flourish here. A culture that tells people like us that we don't belong. Wallace finally managed to speak, his voice trembling. What? What do you want from me? Michael's expression hardened. We want change. Real, measurable change. Starting with how you train your staff and how you treat your guests. And if you're not prepared to make those changes, then perhaps you're not the right person for this job. The director's eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. I assure you, I'm committed to addressing these issues. Angela crossed her arms, her gaze steady. Then prove it. Because we're not here to make requests, Mr. Wallace. We're here to hold you accountable. Michael leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low rumble. And just so we're clear, this isn't a negotiation. Wallace nodded quickly, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Understood. Angela turned to Michael, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. Shall we? Michael nodded, and together they walked out of the dining room, leaving Wallace standing alone, his polished exterior in ruins. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder as the couple disappeared from view, the weight of their presence lingering long after they were gone. In the quiet hallway outside, Angela exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that evening. Think he got the message? She asked. Michael chuckled softly. Oh, he got the message. The question is whether he's smart enough to act on it. Angela nodded, a determined glint in her eye. He better be, because this is just the beginning. A reckoning in the shadows. Angela and Michael walked down the Marlowe's grand hallway, their polished shoes echoing softly on the gleaming marble floors. The ornate decor of the hotel seemed to loom over them, its grandeur a stark reminder of the disparities that had played out only moments before. Angela glanced sideways at her husband, whose stoic expression gave little away, though she knew him well enough to sense the simmering tension beneath his calm exterior. Where to now? Angela asked, her tone light, but tinged with an edge of determination. Michael didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the corridor, as if evaluating every detail. Finally, he said, the top floor. We need to see the heart of their operations. Angela arched an eyebrow. And how do you propose we do that without causing a scene? Michael smiled faintly. We won't need to. The director will bring us there himself. He knows he doesn't have a choice. As if on cue, hurried footsteps approached from behind. Angela turned to see Gregory Wallace, the hotel director, rushing after them. His face was flushed, and his neatly combed hair seemed slightly disheveled, a stark contrast to the composed figure who had first approached their table. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, he called out, his voice tight with a mixture of urgency and unease. Michael slowed his pace, turning to face Wallace with the deliberate calm of someone who knew they held all the cards. Yes, Mr. Wallace, he said, his tone almost casual. Wallace paused, catching his breath before speaking. If you'd allow me, I'd like to personally show you around the hotel. It's clear we need to rebuild your trust, and I believe transparency is the first step. Angela exchanged a glance with Michael, her lips curving into a faint smile. That's a good start, she said. Lead the way. Wallace gestured toward a nearby private elevator, its polished brass doors gleaming under the chandelier's light. This elevator will take us to the executive floor, he explained, his voice trembling slightly. From there, we can access the administrative offices and the conference rooms. As they stepped into the elevator, the air felt charged with unspoken tension. Wallace shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the silent judgment radiating from Angela and Michael. The ride to the top floor was brief, but the weight of the moment made it feel longer. The elevator doors opened to reveal a sleek, modern corridor lined with frosted glass walls. The design was minimalist yet opulent, every detail meticulously curated to exude exclusivity. Wallace led them to a large conference room at the end of the hall, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Inside, the room was dominated by a massive oak table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Angela ran her fingers along the edge of the table as she took a seat, her sharp eyes taking in the room's every detail. Michael remained standing, his imposing presence filling the space. Wallace cleared his throat nervously. "This is where we handle all major decisions regarding the hotel's operations," he explained, his voice faltering slightly under their scrutiny. "I thought it would be an appropriate setting for us to discuss the changes you'd like to see." Michael folded his arms, his gaze unyielding. "Let's start with the basics. How are your employees trained to handle guests?" Wallace blinked, clearly unprepared for the directness of the question. We have a standard onboarding program," he stammered. "It includes customer service protocols and—" "Do those protocols address implicit bias?" Angela interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. Wallace hesitated, his discomfort evident. "Not specifically," he admitted, "but we emphasize professionalism and respect in all interactions." Angela leaned forward, her tone unwavering. "Respect isn't just about professionalism, Mr. Wallace. It's about dismantling the assumptions and prejudices that inform how people are treated. Your staff didn't disrespect us because they lacked training in professionalism. They disrespected us because they assumed we didn't belong here." Wallace opened his mouth to respond, but Michael cut him off. "This isn't just about us," he said, his voice steady but commanding. "How many other guests have faced the same treatment? How many have walked into this hotel and been made to feel invisible?" The director's face reddened, and he looked down at his hands, which were clasped tightly in front of him. I can't speak to that," he said weakly. "You'll need to," Angela said firmly, "because starting today, the culture of this hotel is going to change. And if you can't lead that change, we'll find someone who can." Wallace's head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. "I assure you, I'm fully committed to addressing these issues," he said quickly. "Whatever changes you require, I'll see to it personally." Michael stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over the table. "This isn't about making promises, Mr. Wallace. It's about taking action. Immediate action." Angela nodded, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its authority. "Start by conducting a full audit of your staff's behavior and attitudes toward guests. We want to know exactly where the problems lie and who's responsible. And while you're at it," Michael added, "review your hiring practices. If your team doesn't reflect the diversity of the community you serve, that's part of the problem." Wallace nodded quickly, jotting down notes on a leather-bound notepad. "Understood," he said, his voice subdued. Angela leaned back in her chair, her gaze piercing. "Good, because we're not here to negotiate, Mr. Wallace. We're here to ensure accountability." The director nodded again, his earlier confidence completely shattered. As he scribbled furiously in his notebook, Angela turned to Michael, her expression calm but resolute. "Think he'll follow through?" she asked. Michael's lips curved into a faint smile. "He doesn't have a choice." Wallace looked up from his notes, his face pale but determined. "If I may," he said hesitantly, "why are you so invested in this? I mean, I understand your concerns, but most people would have walked away." Angela's eyes softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "Because walking away doesn't change anything, Mr. Wallace. We've been in places like this before, places that make people like us feel small. But we're not small, and neither is our vision for what this hotel can be." Michael stepped closer, his gaze locked on Wallace. "This isn't just about fixing the Marlowe. It's about setting a standard, one that other establishments will have no choice but to follow." Wallace nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I see," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll do everything in my power to make this right." Angela stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress, as she prepared to leave. "Good," she said, "because this is only the beginning, and we'll be watching closely." As they exited the conference room, Wallace remained seated, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the long list of notes in front of him. The gravity of the moment was not lost on him. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of true accountability, and the realization that the Marlowe's future rested on his ability to rise to the occasion. Back in the elevator, Angela and Michael stood in silence, the city lights flickering through the glass walls as they descended. Angela exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that evening. "Do you think he'll deliver?" she asked quietly. Michael's expression was unreadable as he replied, "He'll try, but whether he succeeds, that depends on how much he's willing to unlearn." Angela nodded thoughtfully, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Well, if he doesn't, we'll be there to remind him." As the elevator doors opened onto the bustling lobby, Angela and Michael stepped out into the warm glow of the chandelier-lit space. They were no longer just guests in the Marlowe. They were the agents of change its walls had long resisted. And they were only getting started, confronting the deep roots. Angela and Michael walked back into the Marlowe's grand lobby, their movements calm but deliberate. The staff at the front desk straightened instinctively, their glances filled with a mix of respect and trepidation. The couple exuded an authority that was impossible to ignore, though they neither raised their voices nor drew attention to themselves unnecessarily. Angela paused near the lavish marble fountain in the center of the lobby, her eyes scanning the opulent surroundings. A striking centerpiece of cascading water and polished stone, the fountain was a symbol of the Marlowe's grandeur, but also a stark reminder of the exclusivity the hotel represented. She turned to Michael, her voice quiet but resolute. "That director has no idea how deep this runs, does he?" Michael adjusted his cufflinks, his expression thoughtful. "I think he's starting to realize it. The real question is whether he has the courage to dig into it." Angela nodded, her gaze shifting toward the guests lounging in the plush seating areas. The subtle hierarchy was palpable even here. Certain patrons were attended to promptly, their every need anticipated, while others lingered at the edges, waiting for service that arrived slowly, if at all. It was a microcosm of the issues they had encountered earlier in the dining room. As Angela and Michael moved toward the elevators leading to their suite, a bellhop approached, his youthful face tense with apprehension. "Excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Wallace asked me to inform you that he has begun the review process you requested." Angela's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you," she replied, her tone warm but firm. "And you are?" The young man hesitated before answering. "Leo, ma'am. I work the afternoon and evening shifts." Michael studied him for a moment before speaking. "How long have you been with the Marlowe, Leo?" 2 years, sir," Leo replied, shifting his weight nervously. "It's been an experience." Angela tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "An experience? Care to elaborate?" Leo glanced around the lobby, as if ensuring no one was listening. "It's not my place to say, ma'am," he said hesitantly. "Leo," Michael said, his tone steady, "if you've noticed things that need to change, now is the time to speak up. We're here to listen." The young bellhop hesitated, his face conflicted. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, not everyone gets treated the same here. Some guests, they get the best service, no matter what. Others, well, it depends." Angela's expression darkened slightly, but her tone remained calm. "Depends on what?" Leo shifted uncomfortably. "On how they look, how they're dressed. Sometimes it feels like people who don't fit a certain image get pushed to the side." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "Thank you for your honesty, Leo. Your observations confirm what we've already seen. Things will change. You have my word." Leo's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, and he nodded. "Thank you, sir. I hope so." As the bellhop walked away, Angela turned to Michael, her expression thoughtful. "It's everywhere, Michael. Every corner of this hotel carries the same message. You don't belong here unless you fit our mold." Michael sighed, his voice heavy with determination. "Then we'll start breaking the mold." one piece at a time. Back in their suite, the couple sat down to review the hotel's operational reports, which Wallace had sent up shortly after their conversation. Angela flipped through the documents, her sharp eyes skimming the figures and notes. What she found was both unsurprising and infuriating. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a section of the report. "Guest satisfaction scores are consistently lower for anyone booking through discounted platforms. And look here, patrons with non-European surnames have a higher rate of complaints about service delays." Michael frowned, leaning over to examine the data. "It's subtle, but the pattern is clear. They're prioritizing perceived wealth and status over basic respect." Angela set the papers down with a sharp exhale. "This isn't just a training issue. It's systemic. The entire structure of how this place operates is built around exclusion." Michael leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Then we'll tear it down and rebuild it." Angela's eyes softened as she looked at her husband. "This is going to be a fight, Michael. Are you ready for that?" Michael reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We've been fighting battles like this our whole lives, Angela. What's one more?" The next morning, Angela and Michael met Wallace in one of the hotel's smaller conference rooms. The director looked visibly strained, dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. He had clearly been working to gather the information they had requested, but his discomfort was palpable as he presented the findings. "These are the initial results of the staff audit," Wallace said, sliding a folder across the table. "I've also included a breakdown of guest demographics and feedback trends over the past 5 years." Angela opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. What she saw confirmed her suspicions: the clear bias in both staffing and service allocation. The data showed that employees from marginalized backgrounds were consistently assigned to less desirable roles, while guests perceived as elite were given preferential treatment at every level. "This is worse than I thought," Angela said, her voice steady but cold. "How did you let it get this bad, Mr. Wallace?" Wallace's face reddened, and he looked down at his hands. I didn't realize," he admitted. "The systems were already in place when I started here. I didn't question them." Michael's voice was sharp as he replied, "Not questioning the system is the same as endorsing it, Mr. Wallace. If you're not actively working to fix the problem, you're part of it." Wallace nodded, his expression contrite. "I understand that now, and I'm committed to making things right." Angela leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Then here's what needs to happen. First, every member of your staff will undergo mandatory training on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. Second, you'll implement a new hiring policy to ensure diversity at every level of the organization. And third, you'll overhaul your guest services protocols to prioritize equity over elitism." Wallace scribbled furiously in his notebook, his head nodding with each point. "Yes, ma'am. I'll get started immediately." Michael's tone softened slightly, but his words carried weight. "This isn't just about avoiding bad press, Mr. Wallace. It's about creating a place where everyone feels valued. If you can't deliver that, we'll find someone who can." Wallace swallowed hard, his determination evident despite his nerves. "I won't let you down." That evening, Angela and Michael walked through the Marlowe's dining room once again. The atmosphere was noticeably different. Staff moved with greater attentiveness, their interactions with guests more genuine. The tension from the previous night had not entirely dissipated, but it was clear that the seeds of change had been planted. As they approached a table near the windows, a young server hesitated before stepping forward. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice steady but slightly nervous. "Welcome back. May I show you to your table?" Angela smiled warmly, nodding in approval. "Thank you. That would be lovely." The server led them to a prime table by the windows, the city lights sparkling in the distance. As they sat down, Angela glanced around the room, noting the subtle but significant shifts in energy. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. "Michael," she said quietly, her eyes shining, We're starting to make a difference." Michael reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "And we're just getting started." The roots of transformation. Angela and Michael spent the next few days immersing themselves in the inner workings of the Marlowe. They shadowed staff members, reviewed years of guest feedback, and held private one-on-one conversations with employees from every department. Each interaction peeled back another layer of the hotel's complex culture, exposing not just its failings but also the quiet frustrations and aspirations of those who worked within its gilded walls. It was during one such conversation with Maria, a housekeeper who had worked at the Marlowe for nearly a decade, that Angela began to understand the depth of the challenges ahead. "Mrs. Carter," Maria began, nervously twisting the hem of her apron, "I've seen so many people come and go here. Guests, managers, even directors like Mr. Wallace. Everyone talks about making things better, but nothing ever changes." Angela leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "What do you think needs to change, Maria? What would make things better for you and your colleagues?" Maria hesitated, glancing around the room as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she said, "Respect. We don't just want higher pay or shorter hours, though those would help. We want to be treated like we matter. Like what we do here is just as important as what happens in the fancy dining room or the executive suites." Angela reached across the table, placing her hand over Maria's. "You do matter, Maria. And I promise you, we're going to prove it, not just with words, but with actions." Maria's eyes glistened with unused tears, and she nodded, a faint smile breaking through her reserved demeanor. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I hope you can." Later that evening, Angela and Michael convened with Gregory Wallace in the grand ballroom, which had been cleared for a full staff meeting. The ornate chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room as employees filed in, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. The couple stood at the front of the room, flanked by Wallace, who looked visibly nervous. When the room settled, Michael stepped forward, his imposing presence commanding the attention of everyone present. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and clear. "For those of you who haven't met us yet, my name is Michael Carter, and this is my wife, Angela. We are the new owners of the Marlowe." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, but Michael continued undeterred. "Over the past few days, Angela and I have had the privilege of speaking with many of you. We've heard your concerns, your frustrations, and your hopes for what this hotel could be. And let me tell you this, we're listening." Angela stepped forward, her tone softer, but no less resolute. "We didn't come here to make small changes or to put a fresh coat of paint on old problems. We came here to transform the Marlowe into a place where everyone, guests and employees alike, feels valued, respected, and welcome." A hand shot up in the crowd. It belonged to a middle-aged man in a maintenance uniform, his face lined with years of hard work. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he said, "we've heard promises like this before. How do we know this time will be different?" Angela nodded, her gaze meeting his. "You're right to be skeptical. Promises mean nothing without follow-through. That's why we're not just telling you what we plan to do. We're going to show you." Michael picked up where Angela left off. "Starting next week, every employee at the Marlowe will be enrolled in a new professional development program. This includes training in cultural sensitivity, conflict resolution, and leadership skills. We're also implementing an anonymous feedback system, so every voice can be heard without fear of retaliation." Angela added, "And we're not stopping there. We're revising our pay structure to ensure fair compensation for everyone, and we're launching a scholarship program for employees who want to pursue further education." The murmurs grew louder, this time tinged with surprise and cautious optimism. A young server near the front raised her hand. "You're saying we can get scholarships? Like for college?" "Yes," Angela replied with a warm smile. "For college, trade school, or any other program that helps you grow and achieve your goals. You've invested your time and energy into making this hotel what it is. It's only fair that we invest in you." The server's eyes widened, and she nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope lighting her expression. As the meeting concluded, Angela and Michael stayed behind to speak with employees who lingered to ask questions or share their thoughts. One of those who approached was Leo, the bellhop they had spoken with earlier. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice hesitant but earnest, "I just wanted to say thank you for listening to us. It means a lot." Michael placed a reassuring hand on Leo's shoulder. "You have our word, Leo. We're not just listening. We're acting." The next morning, Angela and Michael began implementing their changes in earnest. They started with the dining room, where the maitre d' who had initially dismissed them was now undergoing rigorous retraining alongside the rest of the restaurant staff. Angela personally oversaw the sessions, emphasizing the importance of empathy and equity in every interaction. Meanwhile, Michael turned his attention to the hotel's operational systems. He worked closely with the maintenance and housekeeping teams, ensuring they had the resources and support needed to do their jobs effectively. He also introduced a new scheduling system designed to distribute workloads more fairly. But the most significant shift came in the hotel's culture. The Carters made it clear that discrimination and bias of any kind would not be tolerated. They established a zero-tolerance policy for harassment and encouraged employees to report any incidents without fear of reprisal. The changes didn't come without resistance. Some long-term employees grumbled about the new policies, and a few even resigned, unwilling to adapt to the more inclusive environment. But for every detractor, there were dozens of employees who embraced the changes wholeheartedly, inspired by the Carters' vision and determination. One evening, as Angela walked through the dining room, she noticed Maria serving a family at one of the prime tables near the windows. The housekeeper-turned-server moved with a newfound confidence, her interactions with the guests warm and professional. Angela smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Michael joined her moments later, a glass of wine in hand. "Not bad for a week's work," he said, his tone light but filled with satisfaction. Angela chuckled softly. "Not bad at all, but we're just getting started." As they stood together, watching the Marlowe's transformation unfold before their eyes, Angela felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be many, but she knew one thing for certain: they were building something extraordinary. Together, a new standard. The Marlowe hummed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. The gilded walls and marble floors were no longer a cold fortress of exclusivity, but instead radiated a warmth that made even the most hesitant guests feel welcome. Angela and Michael stood in the grand lobby, watching as staff moved with a newfound purpose, and guests, both old and new, flowed through the space with ease. The changes were taking root, but the couple knew the work was far from over. Real transformation required more than new policies. It demanded a cultural shift, one that would take time, patience, and unrelenting dedication. An unexpected letter. Angela's morning began with a surprise. A neatly folded letter lay on her desk, delivered by the newly implemented anonymous feedback system. She unfolded it, her brows furrowing as she read the handwritten words. "Dear Mrs. Carter, I was one of the guests in the dining room that night. I watched everything that happened, and I didn't speak up. I laughed with my friends, pretending it wasn't my problem, but it was. You and your husband deserve better. I see that now. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like. You've changed this hotel, and in some ways, you've changed me. I'm sorry for my silence." The note was unsigned, but it brought a lump to Angela's throat. She passed it to Michael, who read it quietly before setting it down with a solemn nod. "It's working," he said simply. Angela smiled faintly, one ripple at a time. Shifting perspectives. The couple's next challenge was the hotel's clientele. While many patrons embraced the Marlowe's evolving ethos, others bristled at the changes. A few longtime guests had even voiced their displeasure directly, claiming that the new policies diminished the hotel's exclusivity. One such confrontation occurred during a quiet afternoon in the lobby. A sharply dressed man approached Angela as she reviewed staff schedules on her tablet. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his tone icy but polite, "I'd like to express my concerns about the direction this hotel is taking." Angela set her tablet aside, meeting his gaze with calm composure. "I'm always open to feedback. Please, go ahead." The man cleared his throat, glancing around the lobby as if to ensure his words wouldn't be overheard. The Marlowe has always been a sanctuary for a certain caliber of guest. Your inclusivity policies are admirable, but they risk alienating the very people who made this hotel what it is. Angela's smile didn't waver, but her tone turned firm. "And who are those people, sir?" "Because the way I see it, this hotel was built by its staff and sustained by every guest who's ever walked through its doors, regardless of their background." The man stiffened, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "I understand your perspective, Mrs. Carter, but I fear you may be diluting the Marlowe's brand." Angela rose to her feet, her posture commanding yet composed. "The Marlowe's brand is changing, sir. It's becoming a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, not just those who fit a particular mold. If that's not the kind of hotel you want to patronize, I understand, but I won't compromise on what's right." The man's expression darkened, but he said nothing further, turning on his heel and walking away. As Angela watched him leave, she felt a surge of pride. Change wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about standing firm in the face of resistance. Empowering the team. Michael spent much of his time working directly with the Marlowe staff, particularly those in less visible roles. He implemented mentorship programs that paired seasoned employees with newer hires, fostering a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. One of the most impactful initiatives was the creation of a staff council, a group of employees elected by their peers to represent their voices in management decisions. During the first council meeting, Michael addressed the room with his usual calm authority. "This isn't just about giving you a seat at the table," he said. "It's about making sure your voices shape the future of this hotel. You know better than anyone what works and what doesn't. Your input is invaluable." The council members, a diverse group representing every department, nodded with a mix of excitement and apprehension. For many of them, this was the first time they felt truly heard. One of the housekeepers, an older woman named Carmen, spoke up. "Mr. Carter, we've been ignored for so long. It's hard to believe this is real." Michael smiled, his voice gentle but firm. "It's real, Carmen, and it's just the beginning." The grand reopening. After months of tireless work, the Marlowe hosted its grand reopening gala, an event designed to showcase the hotel's transformation. Invitations were sent to longtime patrons, local community leaders, and employees' families. The ballroom was transformed into a glittering celebration of unity, with live music, gourmet cuisine, and an atmosphere of genuine joy. Angela and Michael stood at the entrance, personally welcoming each guest. As the evening unfolded, they moved through the crowd, engaging in conversations and listening to stories from those who had been part of the journey. Maria approached them midway through the evening, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Mrs. Carter, I wanted to thank you for everything. I never thought I'd be serving in the dining room, let alone at an event like this." Angela placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. "You earned it, Maria. This is just the start of what you're capable of." As the night drew to a close, Michael took the stage to address the crowd. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice steady and resonant. "When Angela and I took over the Marlowe, we saw more than just a hotel. We saw potential, a potential to create something extraordinary. Tonight, as I look around this room, I see that potential realized. This isn't just a place for luxury. It's a place for community, respect, and shared purpose. And we're not done yet." The room erupted in applause, the energy electric. Angela joined him on stage, her smile radiant, as she looked out at the faces of employees, guests, and community members who had come together to celebrate this new chapter. A legacy of change. In the months that followed, the Marlowe became a beacon of transformation, its reputation shifting from one of exclusivity to one of excellence rooted in inclusivity. Word spread, attracting guests who valued the hotel's commitment to fairness and respect. Former employees returned, eager to be part of the new culture, and the staff council became a cornerstone of the hotel's operations. Angela and Michael often reflected on their journey, knowing that their work at the Marlowe was just the beginning. They had set a new standard, not just for the hotel, but for themselves, and for anyone who dared to believe that change was possible. One evening, as they sat by the grand windows of the dining room, Angela looked out at the city lights, her heart full. "We did it," she said softly. Michael reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We started it," he corrected. "And that's enough for now." Their glasses clinked softly, a quiet toast to the legacy they were building, one rooted in resilience, vision, and an unwavering belief in the power of change.